Welcome everyone for the kickoff meeting for the open source research experience for the summer 2022. As you all saw that, we're trying to expand this program to to other campuses of the University of California and also the national labs that are affiliated with University of California. So this is the open source research experience is a program that we developed at CROSS for the last 2 years. CROSS is the Center for Research in Open Source Software. But before we go into that detail, let me just first introduce us, Stephanie and me. So next slide. Okay. So I'm Carlos Malzahn. I'm an adjunct professor at UC Santa Cruz. I'm also the founder and director of the Center for Research in Open Source Software that was founded in 2015. I'm also the co-founder and director of the Systems Research Lab here at UC Santa Cruz. And before I joined UC Santa Cruz, I was a performance engineer at NetApp. I'm currently advising 6 PhD students, and I graduated 9 PhD students and 11 master students. If you want to know more about me, you can go to that website, people.ucsc.edu/carlosm. So I mostly focus on programmable storage systems, Arrow native storage. Arrow means that's related to Apache Arrow, the in-memory representation of table data. And more generally, I'm interested in big data storage and processing, scalable data management, distributed systems performance management, and also practical reproducibility. And we are just finishing up the SC21 reproducibility initiative that I chaired. All right, that's enough from me. Stephanie.
Hold on there. Multiple screens up. Hi, I'm Stephanie Luigi. I'm the assistant director here at CROSS. Previously I worked in a fully different field, but I've been here at CROSS since 2016. And in my time here, I've focused a lot of attention on supporting our open source projects here, both our incubator and our research projects. As well as working towards helping them and helping others support open source communities and enabling sustainable contributor bases within our communities. I also focus a lot of attention on promoting academic or open source in academic settings. And I spend a lot of time also focusing on creating a more diverse and inclusive open source culture, particularly here in academia. And one of the big projects that I've worked on with Carlos over the last 2 years is the one that we'll talk about today, which is the open source research experience. Oops. Moving on.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. And by the way, if you have any questions, clarification questions while we're presenting, please interrupt us. Raise your hand or you're a small enough group, you can just start talking. So the last 6 years of CROSS, we had, some really good lessons learned. One thing that really stood out is that successful open source projects are a really powerful catalyst for industry engagement, right? And so we want to basically, with the open source research experience, we want to connect sponsors with researchers and students, and do this through open source, so these open source projects. They're also, open source research projects are also really good outreach opportunities for inclusiveness. And so this is, the open source community has a mixed history, as you all know, about inclusiveness, and it's not very gender balanced, for example. But I think universities have a particularly important role to play change that culture for the better. So I want to look at the stakeholders of this open source research experience a little bit. So we have sponsors, and our lessons were that sponsors really prioritize research over open source. A lot of efforts that you see in academia have tried to get sponsorship for open source for the open source sake. And this program is really different. It actually takes research first and uses open source as a means to create higher impact of or to amplify the impact of your research. What we also found, though, is that the industry really prefers open source licensing over other licensing terms that the university has traditionally used, especially when it comes around systems, software systems. Then the next stakeholder is the cross fellow. So this is actually a particular role that we have at CROSS, the Center for Research in Open Source Software. It's either a research fellow or an incubator fellow. Those are people who are, the research fellows are typically PhD students who, work on their PhD project. And we fund them because their project has a plausible path to a successful open source project. But we don't evaluate them by how much software they write or typical open source metrics, but we just evaluate them by how successful they are in the research, right? But what we found is that these cross fellows have, and then before I go into that, and then there's the incubator fellows where it's sort of flipped. Those are typically postdocs, but there we don't actually evaluate their research, but we evaluate how well they are able to build a contributor community around their research prototypes. And they basically apply for this program with the intent to build such a community around the research prototypes, to stabilize it and to make it more available for the public. So what we found is that both kinds of cross fellows have great project ideas. That's just part of their activity, right? And they are also great student mentors and are ambassadors for best open source practices. And what we've that the students that get involved in these projects, and this is where we get to the third stakeholder, which are the students, are actually a fantastic way to seed their open source communities around their research prototypes. And students really want to learn how to engage in these open source ecosystems that are becoming more and more important in industry. And so that combination of students constantly looking for projects, looking for mentors, but also looking to how to get involved in open source ecosystems is actually, I think, a very explosive combination that we are really trying to bring together. There's a lot of energy here. Next slide. So this is just a picture of what I just talked about. But I wanted to emphasize that open source projects, at least in my view, are really, it's not just software in a GitHub repository, right? It's open source projects that are successful and are thriving are more, there can be, at least I think they can be compared to coral reefs, where they have a lot of organisms, we, like the developers, that constantly take care of them and they kind of grow, right? But they only grow if there's life that takes care of it. And so these fish are basically the students, the postdocs, the sponsors that kind of take care and grow these open source projects. But there are also hopefully more communities, and it's those communities around those open source projects that are really the important part, and that stabilize these projects and make them more sustainable. So the researchers, we offer them to bring in new excited developers to their open source communities. We offer sponsors to engage with researchers and new student talents on exciting new open source technologies. And we offer to students that they can spend a summer writing code for exciting open source projects and really build out their professional network and their skills doing that. Next slide. So, oops. Wait, did I miss this? Okay. So the open source research experience consists of a number of components, right? And it's basically just another summary of what I said before. It's essentially a marketplace of project ideas. And it's marketplace is maybe not so good word. We recently came up with a better word, which is an exchange. It's an exchange where project ideas mentors create project ideas, and then students offer to help with these project ideas, and sponsors provide funding for the students to actually perform this work. And what we found is that it really jumpstarts contributor communities. You can really create more people that are involved in your projects. Students really get to work with top scientists on something. The mentorship is really awesome. And the really exciting part is that we are leveraging global outreach programs to do that. This is actually the key part why you should actually participate in the open source research experience. And I'm gonna, next slide, please. Talk a little bit about that, how that looks like. So, so the way this works is we have a project ideas catalog. It's basically just a website. It's in fact just a file in a GitHub repository right now called projects MD. It's a markdown file. It's very simple to edit, and you can update it by simply issuing a pull request, and then and then you can add new project ideas and projects. Basically, you post your project ideas, and then the student and mentors work closely together to build a proposal. So it's an application, and this process of doing that, basically you as a mentor determine very quickly probably whether that student who contacted you to work with you on that project is a good match. And once you sort of decide, okay, this is somebody I can work with, the student, you kind of help the student to actually come up with a good proposal. The student sends in the proposal, the mentors pick the favorites proposals, and let us know, right? And then the slots, we assign funding slots depending on the kind of funding we can raise, and the kind of foundations and other outreach efforts that we partner with. And then those slots basically, depending on how many matches you find and how much funding and how much interest there is from industry, we assign the slots, and then the coding can begin. So we have an example project ideas catalog that's from last summer, and you can sort of look at some of this. We actually have some projects from Lawrence Berkeley Lab on there already, and so we hope that we get many more project ideas. The nice thing about this project ideas catalog is just one point that you can share very easily. We can then shop this page with the Linux Foundation, with Google Summer of Code, with NSF institutes like the Institute for Research and Innovation Software, for, let's say, high energy physics, but there might be other fellowships that you are aware of that would also like to, spend the money allocated for these fellowships on the best matches they can find. And so this is a way to kind of have a consolidated view of all these project ideas that you can then easily shop around. So think of it as sort of being part of a pooled proposal for funding summer students. Next slide. So in the last 2 years, we just did it for UC Santa Cruz itself, but last summer we funded 9 students that were identified by mentors. 4 of them were at UC Santa Cruz, 5 were international, and they were across 4 different research groups. And we had 4 funding sources, right? So 3 extramural funding sources. That was Google Summer of Code, IRIS-HEP, and Cloud Native Computing Foundation. The really interesting thing is that those funding streams, they're based on that amount of funding is actually also, it's not only good for the students, but it's also good for us because we can then put a value on the open source activity. We can actually say, those open source activities were funded by this amount of money, right? And that's starting to connect open source activities with dollar signs or with dollar numbers. And that's actually a long-term goal for us, is to really put a dollar value on the kind of funding value, if you will, that open source projects create. And so, next slide. So this brings us to the Open Source Research Experience 22. So it's starting this month. We are in November collecting project ideas from you. All UC affiliated researchers, as well as researchers from national labs affiliated to University of California. That's Lawrence Livermore National Labs, Los Alamos National Labs, and Lawrence Berkeley Lab. We try to get critical mass of this project by November 30th, by the end of this month. Then December and February, we focus on industry funding. This is because industry is on the cycle where, as most of you know, where basically they make decision in January how much money they're going to set aside for summer students. And we, from our membership at Cross, that industry is very interested in these summer internships. As often summer internships are just students that they want to have within the company, and then they can do projects that are proprietary. But they're also very interested in having students to work on open source projects that they find interested, and they're willing to sponsor those activities. And then in the first quarter of 22, we're using Google Summer of Code and all these other outreach programs to advertise this catalog of project ideas. So we're using the catalog both for raising industry funding, as well as actually, getting into this process of being involved in these other outreach efforts. So the Google Summer of Code, just an example, has this a point where mentor organizations have to apply, right, to be part of that year's Google Summer of Code. And so this would be then one mentor organization, right? Then you can sort of think of like, this is the University of California mentor organization. And there's precedents for other large mentor organizations, like CERN is a very large mentor organization, gets lots of slots for doing so. So this is something that we like to establish, that the University of California has this Google Summer of Code mentor organization that allow people to easily get involved in Google Summer of Code, but also other outreach programs. And having a sort of consolidated catalog makes that very easy. Next slide. So why should you be a mentor in this program? So the benefit of pooling projects and project ideas allows you to efficiently leverage outreach programs like Google Summer of Code. And this is both for publicity and fundraising. So Google Summer of Code, for instance, is an outreach effort that is really worldwide. It's well known. It's been, I don't know how many years, over 15 years. Yeah?
16 years.
16 years, right?
17 years. Oh.
17 years, so in a 17th year. And so when they actually accept, us, and we did this 3 times now at Cross, when they accept you as a mentor organization, you really get visibility worldwide. But then they also fund students, right? They assign slots to mentorship organization or mentor organizations. And so that process, we align our deadlines with that process, right? But this also happens to be aligned pretty well with other fellowships. So this is actually a really nice way to basically pool your ideas in one place, and then have that pool basically being shopped around to various outreach efforts. It's also really a compelling point for engagement for both students, new student talent, and industry, right? So that's also, so students find out about this place, right, and can look at it and see a wide variety of things, and that will increase the number of students that are interested in this, and that will hopefully also spread. The word will spread, right, and will create more attraction. So this is clearly a network effect that happens when you have more and more project ideas in one place. And then the third thing is that students really enjoy being part of something large. They can say, we've been part of the open source research experience. We also, and they can also then add the fact when they find out that they're actually funded by Google Summer of Code, that they also be part of Google Summer of Code cohort. So these cohort are really an important validation of that they kind of, an accomplishment. It gives them a sense of accomplishment and belonging. So that's really important. So we have, we have an administrative framework to do this. One of the biggest feedback we get always is that mentors really appreciate that we take away from them quite a bit of administrative burden. But we also, as I said earlier, right, with having this pool, we actually can connect these open source research efforts with like numbers of dollars, right? So this is actually a really important goal, as I mentioned earlier, to make the university leadership of all the campuses aware of the importance of open source. And nothing is more convincing than to, if you have a large dollar figure that basically says, look at all the stuff that people can raise with these open source efforts and these open source programs. So with that, I want to give it over to Stephanie. Please interrupt if you have any questions. And we can now hopefully also have some time afterwards to answer questions.
And I think some of the slides I have coming up are kind of the FAQ almost type question answered. I mean, answers that you may have, because it goes through some of the details of the actual activity. First off, the big question typically is, well, what do you expect from sponsors? And generally what we expect, from mentors, what we expect from mentors are, as Carlos mentioned, project ideas. So that's the critical part. That's definitely the first thing we need. And Carlos already mentioned where those project ideas go. And we can talk a little bit more about the details of how to do that later if you're interested. Again, Carlos mentioned the November 30th as kind of being the time when we want to have the critical mass. And these ideas are not, these ideas can change and they can be altered throughout the few months, like in December and January. But the main thing is to show our potential sponsors the types of projects that that we will be having. And again, the project ideas are a subset of projects under your larger open source project. So, and the sponsors are going to look at what they're really supporting are your main project, and the project ideas are the parts of that that activity over the summer that the students specifically work on. Each of the project ideas should have one primary mentor and one backup mentor. And we do this, and this has worked great throughout our period doing these type of both OSRE and in our GSAC when we first started as GSAC mentor organization. And it's really helpful to have both for the student continuity, but also for potential, generally speaking, we expect mentors not to work more than I think 5 hours per week on with one particular student. And sometimes if that seems like a lot, it's good to actually have a backup mentor to help out and to take the workload down, but also continuity for students. So a lot of it is if a mentor has to go away or has a vacation plan over the time, then it helps to have a backup mentor for the student to go to. I see a question in the chat. Is there? Oh, sorry, that was just a So those are the project ideas, and you have Carlos mentioned the document we have already up, the GitHub page we have up, and that can give you some ideas of what we're looking for, and I'll also be putting out a mentor overview and the mentor guidelines that will also give some ideas. Now, and also a really important part, of course, is the commitment to mentor itself. And that generally means, that generally starts during the application phase. Carlos mentioned that already. That part of the process is that the student will reach out to you and ask you for advice on the application related to the project idea that you posted. It is typically a bit of an iterative process, although the student is expected to do all the heavy lifting and you're expected to, as a mentor, to put comments in. And again, that gives you as a mentor a great opportunity to figure out whether they are a good fit for you and for your project in that period. Typically also, the mentor is expected to help introduce the student into the community that they're going to interact with over the summer. So that's your onboarding responsibility. But again, that's just the introductions, the actual administrative type of onboarding is still on our end. And then of course, guiding them through the coding phase, which is in the summer. I won't go into too much detail here, and we'll probably put more into the mentor guidelines that we'll be working up in the next couple of weeks about how long that phase is. Typically it's 10 to 12 weeks. But we do have some flexibility on that. But typically and I'll show you that in the timeline soon, that typically is from June to August. And during the coding period, there is some evaluations. They're pretty easy. We sort of base them on what Google Summer of Code does, which is a like 3 or 4 question Google form that you have to fill out that basically says a student is doing fine or a student is not doing fine, and give some comments. But it's typically takes less than 10 minutes, and it's only twice in the summer, a midterm and a final, basically. This is the timeline that we have. Exact dates are to be confirmed, and part of that is because the other programs that Carlos mentioned, that we are trying to work in parallel with, be it GSOC or one of the other fellowship programs that we want to kind of include in this process, haven't put their timelines out. So we want to make sure that they mesh up. But these are the general timelines with regards to which months you will expect something to happen. As Carlos mentioned, the November 30th mentors posting as many project ideas as possible. And then in December, January, and some into February, we actually start looking at our industry sponsorship. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But then you also start seeing, once the projects are up, and there are at least one former mentor on the call who can say that as soon as the ideas pages are up, you start to have some students reaching out to you who are interested. The February was when we actually start to narrow down which sponsors will actually be supporting for the summer. And then and in the parallel, we also are working on our GSOC application and other fellowship applications to get funding through those organizations. Typically, the students work with the mentors through March. The deadline for the applications is typically early April. Again, that can shift a bit. And then by May, the mentors are told how many slots, so how many students you will have funded for you and for your projects. And then you get to make the selection of which students you want to work with. And then we announce it, and then you start your introduction period. It's called community bonding in the GSOC frame parlay, but I just call it the introduction to the community. As I said, the coding time or the work time is typically between June and August, with some flexibility in start and end dates, depending on the student and the mentor's needs. Typically, all the projects get wrapped up in September or by September, with a chance for us to kind of highlight some of the work that students have been doing, and maybe put out stories on our website or on other places. And it all culminates really in October, when we highlight all the students in our research symposium. Last year and up until this year, we've had a cross research symposium. In the last 2 years, we've been able to highlight our OSRE students. Next year, we'll probably do one that's a little more UC wide, which will also then be able to include open source projects from other UC campuses. And in that setting, we'll also have something that specifically focuses on our open source research experience students. Just to answer any questions you might have about how the fundraising works. So I'll talk a little bit about how sponsorship recruitment works, and also how student recruitment and the students work in the next slide. For fundraising or sponsorship recruitment, we will have outreach specifically to industry sponsors, as I said, starting in December and moving into January, possibly a little bit into February. But as Carlos was mentioning, we like to, industry likes to make those decisions by January, so we want to focus our attention in that period. We have outreach, we say, to non-industry sponsors that, as I was saying, like the fellowships, the GSOC, that type of activity also is in similar period, January to February. And now sponsors can actually be anything from foundation, can include non-industry sources, so foundations, public government and agencies. If there's any sponsors that you think of that maybe it would be helpful for them to work through us, to support you, because we have, like I said, an established framework that's relatively easy to work with. Let us know when we can reach out and do that and do that process with them. Once we have our sponsors identified, we collect feedback from them, just particularly from the industry sponsors who are going through the kind of the industry sponsorship, say not necessarily the fellowship sponsors. And then we connect them with the mentors. So, and then the slots we have are allocated based on basically who the best student is from your perspective, and who the mentors match with, as well as industry interests. So if the industry sponsors have some specific interest in your project, then that is weighted as whether or not you get a slot. You get that slot, right? Now with student contributors, just to clarify kind of the type of students that we typically work with and what we kind of envision working with in the coming year. As we mentioned, students come from everywhere. Our GSOC students that we've had prior to starting OSRE were all non-US students, so they came from everywhere in the world. Since we started the OSRE program, we've had students from, I think, 5 or 6 different countries, as well as US students, but they're basically from anywhere. And we have an administrative setup that allows us to actually give them stipends and compensate them for their work. We've mainly worked with undergraduate students, but can also support graduate students. Of the about 30 that we worked with since we started, in the GSOC, as a GSOC mentor organization up till now, as with the OSRE, including all the OSRE students, we've had about 2 out of 30 or so that have been graduate students, but it's not something that we exclude. For those of you wondering about stipends, which is a question I get a lot about how do they get paid, we typically, we will actually base our stipends for student contributors on the purchasing power parity rate that is published by GSOC. GSOC does a lot of work to get the amount kind of figured out for every country that they're allowed to work in, which is basically every country in the world aside from a few embargoed countries. So we let them do all that work and we use their numbers. And typically it works out to be about $5,500 US per summer, so per student for the summer. But in local, like in the purchasing power parity rate, so at local rates. And this year we can also choose to work. You can make a choice about the size of the project, whether you want a full or part-time work. So I know we had a question earlier from a participant, whether or not, or a potential mentor, about how number of hours, and a lot of that kind of depends on the size of your project, and then we just adjust the stipend based on that, on like the number of hours that you indicate, or you and the student indicate that they expect to work on this project. Now, something I want to really highlight, and this is I think important, is that having a diverse group of contributors is really an essential metric for our program success. We see diversity in open source and diversity, and particularly in our projects, to be very important and essential for our sustainability in the long term. So accessibility, equity, and inclusivity is a super important consideration for the final determination of slots. And so I just keep that in mind. And one thing I think is also related to that is that we also encourage mentors to include project ideas of all experience levels. And if you look at the project ideas page that we have now, we do have a kind of an indicator on there about difficulty level, easy, medium, and high. I'll give more details on that when I do the mentor guide. But we're particularly interested in having projects included that are well suited for those who are new to coding. Since one of the project and new to open source as well. Because one of the intentions of this program in general is to bring new and diverse groups into open source. Right. So next steps at the moment are, well, let us know if you're interested. That's important. And you can do that either by letting us know now, emailing us, or even just starting by adding project ideas. And we can go through the process on how to do that a little bit. Again, as I said, a mentor guide will be available soon. And it will go through some of the details, and it's iterative. So if there's something missing on there, it'll probably just be a big Google Doc. If there's something missing on there, you let me know, or you can put a comment on it, and we can clarify things as we go. And also consider attending student outreach efforts that we will be having in December and January. In the past, we haven't done this. We've typically just kind of, opened our list, open our project ideas list to the world and let students come to us. But it was highlighted to us that sometimes there are students, particularly in groups that are historically excluded, that sometimes there's a level of bashfulness, let's say, of an uncertainty about reaching out to a mentor. So we want to try and break that barrier down. And part of what we're going to do, and was suggested to us, was to actually have more student outreach efforts that include things like breakout sessions, where students get to meet with mentors who may be working on projects they're interested in. So again, that'll be obviously on Zoom, and it'll be something like this, but then within breakout sessions and small groups. So mentors who are interested, that would be a great opportunity also for you to meet one-on-one, or not one-on-one, but in a small group at least, with students who are interested. All right, that was it. So unless we have, this is a great opportunity for anybody to have who has any questions. I also would love to hear from past mentors. There's one on the call. There was two at one point, but we lost one. So if Aaron, you're on the call, if you had any comments that anything you think we missed with regards to the mentor experience, that'd be great. And also open it up to anybody who has questions.
Stephanie and Carlos, this is Indira. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's very interesting. So I just had a couple of questions. One is how, so the mentors are from the UC network, correct?
Yes.
And the student network that you're currently reaching out to and you're continuously building, how is that handled? I mean, what's the makeup of the student network today?
It's global.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. It's global. It's basically anyone that found a good match with a mentor that we had.
I see. Okay.
And if you're talking about for outreach as well, or for just what we've experienced with what we've received in applications?
Yeah, I mean, your current student network, and I guess you also, reach out. So you're, adding, I guess, building the network continuously, right? So
right.
And to understand, what kind of students are we reaching out to in the, what's the composition? And, yeah.
I was gonna say, composition-wise, we've had a pretty, like Carlos said, was pretty wide internationally. I think that from a certain groups that I would categorize as kind of historically excluded, I think we could do better, and that's one of the pushes that we have this year. I think we're planning on reaching out to organizations particularly within UC, but also outside UC, that we'll be focusing on maybe first gen communities, other groups that focus on women in engineering, for instance. We're also going to talk to historically Black colleges and universities here in the US, and then rely on some of our GSOC outreach, but also other fellowship programs that also reach a wide range of students.
Yeah,
right.
And we hope that by feel free to also share this effort with your student network. We want to advertise this as widely as possible. I think that's the good thing. If there's one thing you can share, right, and a lot of people are sharing it, it becomes really well known.
Yeah, that's another thing
Ahmed.
too.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry, I was gonna say,
Thank you.
if anybody had suggestions on groups that they know about that maybe we don't know about, that'd be awesome to hear from. So, sorry.
Right. Ahmed.
Yes.
Ahmed, or is it Ahmed or Ahmed? I don't
Ahmed,
know.
yeah.
Ahmed. Okay.
So yeah, thanks a lot for the presentation and for organizing actually this nice project and opening it up for other UC campuses. So I have two questions. One of them more clarification question. So you mentioned that the involvement of students is usually from 10 to 12 weeks. I assume this is full time, right? So I assume students will be full time working on the project during that time. Is this correct?
Actually, this year we can adjust to have part time. It kind of depends on what the mentor needs. Just to clarify, part of the part-time, full-time, before we never even thought about doing something that's particularly part-time. In this last year, the Google Summer of Code actually did everything as a part-time because of the pandemic. They didn't want to overburden students. And though this year coming back, they have actually chosen to create this, to do both this year. And because of that, and because that's one of the fellowships that we try and parallel as much as possible. I'm trying to integrate that as well into the OSRE, generally speaking. So we will have so ultimately we'll be seeing if you have a project that maybe doesn't require the full 10 weeks and maybe just needs like, 5 weeks, or maybe instead of, have 10 weeks but part-time, that would be something that's totally an option, and you would just mark it as medium-sized project versus a large-sized project. And then I think we're talking, and then yeah, whatever, full-time is considered 30 to, I'd say 35 hours-ish a week. And then, part-time is half of that-ish a week. And again, over the 10 to 12 weeks. And then we adjust the stipends based on the number, basically the timeline of the project, but we typically won't go over a paid stipend of 12 weeks, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. I have another question about the type of projects that are supported. Are you open to projects about documentation? Because there are very nice.
Oh yeah, yes. I meant to mention that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Good question.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that is a great project for first timers, or for people that are feeling a little uncertain about their code or coding abilities, and also a great way to get folks in who don't consider themselves naturally coders or something. And I think those are great projects to be added. Yes. So if I didn't make that clear, I'm sorry about that. Other projects like that basically anything that contributes to an open source project here at a UC, within a UC system that helps build its community or makes it sustainable, we cover it. So, and documentation for sure.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That is my question. Thanks.
Oscar.
Hey guys. So my question, I guess, is a bit dual to Ahmed's, or expands on it, which is, are there any kind of criteria on the outcomes that are expected out of these projects? Or is there something that's not supported or not desired? So clearly documentation is one.
Yeah, so in general, whenever you don't like the outcome, that's not satisfactory, right? So we leave it to mentors. What we want is very satisfied mentors. We want that experience to be as positive as possible, right? And so it's not about, we have to leave it to mentors to evaluate that, right? There's no way we can evaluate all these projects, especially when we want to grow. And so when you have a bad experience, right, let us know. But actually, the more important thing is that you come back next year. And if you have a bad experience, you're probably not going to come back, right? And so that's I think why this actually works, right? We want that. We want you basically say whether you consider that project to be a success.
Awesome.
And just to, like I said, I think my math, if I'm doing the math right, like I said, we've done 30 of these types of summer projects between all the earlier GSOC work and then all the OSRE projects we've had the last 2 years. And we've had I want to say 100% success rate on happy mentors at the end. Not everybody's been able to come back for workload or whatever reasons, but everyone has called their projects a success. Just at least, and seeing their projects as being a benefit to seeing the students' contributions as a benefit to their overall project. And that's been great. And that's something we want to keep up, even if we expand this. And I agree with Carlos, a lot of it has to do with what the mentor is, what the mentor's decisions are, but also that interaction that happens between the mentor and the ultimately chosen student in the winter is I think a critical part of why we've had success in this. And also I think we just have really good mentors who are used to working with students. And we didn't really get into that too much, but typically our mentors are just used to working with undergraduates because as either a postdoc or a graduate student or faculty, they've just are used to that. And I think that that's helped out a lot.
So one thing that we observed is, and that's something to look out for, right? For mentors, so if you have a backup mentor who's a junior student, right? They sometimes require additional effort by the senior member of the project to really tease out if there are any authority problems, right? And that can happen sometimes, that junior students, they don't have the authority over the student who's, or junior mentors might not have the authority to really direct a student contributor as much as they need to. And so catching that is really important, right? And then you just have to basically get in a more senior person and says, this junior guy is really, or person and woman is really good at what she is doing. And you should listen to her advice, right? And so this is something that we found in the past that sometimes happens if you have junior mentors in there. But in general, I think the mentor-student relationship is working as expected.
And I think it's important also, that's a good point about the co-mentor. We mentioned that briefly, but we've had any number of configurations on that. We've had the typical one is a primary mentor who asks somebody they work with, either a colleague or a student that works with them, but maybe a little senior, like Carlos was explaining, to co-mentor. We've also had people who like groups. One project gets 3 students, and they have 3 mentors, and they so one mentor, each mentor maybe is a primary mentor for one student, but the co-mentor for another, and so they just kind of circulate, and that's cool too. And again, that creates your own small cohort inside the bigger cohort, and that's worked out really well too. So there's a lot of different ways of doing it, but it is really, really useful. I don't want to like say, oh, you need to always have to have 2 mentors, but I think it's super helpful. And we do require to at least have a backup mentor for all projects. And I do like the idea. I have actually seen it work well. And Carlos highlights a fallback, problem sometimes that can happen with more younger mentors, but as long as you're just aware of it and keep it in mind, it's been definitely something that this has been a great, I think, experience for mentors who are younger, who haven't mentored before. And we have one, unfortunately not on the call, but one of our students started out as a GSOC student working with us 2-3 years ago, and then became a mentor with us the next year, and now is one of our PhD students. So yeah.
Okay. Nice.
He definitely found it as a very positive experience. So.
Okay.
So Stephanie, you mentioned you might want to have some feedback
yes.
from me, because I had 3 OSRE students last summer. And I think I can speak a little bit to all of these questions. So starting with Indira's question about the students, particularly if Cross gets into the Google Summer of Code or gets Google Summer of Code as one of their mentor organizations, the students flock to you. You get inundated with applications if you have interesting projects to work on. So My experience was that starting in February and March, I was getting dozens of emails from prospective students, and I worked with more than I care to remember in developing what I think were successful applications. So that's where the student base comes from without the outreach. I think doing the outreach is a really good idea this year, because then you can bring in a different type of student researcher. But for me, the most amount of time I spent on this project was actually in the pre-phase, sort of developing successful project proposals that they come up with for their applications. And then finally, Oscar, you mentioned, are there criteria for the outcomes? And I think that it should be included explicitly in the project proposal. And in particular with Google Summer of Code, you get to evaluate at the end of the period whether or not they've met their project goals. And they don't get paid if they don't actually meet the explicit project goal criteria. So it's really important to make sure that the outcomes are cleanly specified in the applications. Yeah, I think that's all of the notes that I took.
I want to give Aaron a bit of a shout out, because he actually had the single most applications ever, like by a number of fold of any project that we had ever put up on Project Ideas. So I mean, he, as a mentor, he and his co-mentor dealt with, I think, double what would be normal. So he had a lot, but that's not normal. Well, and I've explained that to Aaron before. I've told that to Aaron before. That's not normal. I can't believe you have that many. Well, he had a very, very, very popular project that he put up there. So, and he did a great job. So it was kind of like a decent problem to have, because you also got some really awesome students out of it, as I recall. So.
Really, we did. Yeah, we had some great contributions.
All right. We can hang on a little bit longer if people have more questions. Otherwise, we're at time.
Yeah. So this is all recorded. We will make the recording available, as soon as possible. And I know a number of people wanted to attend, but we had conflicts. Indira.
Sorry, and last question. How do you handle, data confidentiality, IP protection?
So it's an open source project. Everything has to be, at the end, has to be part of an open source repository. Everything that was created. Now, if you have any experiments that might result in a paper, talk with us or talk to us, and we can resolve what how you can not. Maybe you don't have the experimental results in the repository, right? Just the code, but we do require that everything that's getting produced in these projects is going to have an open source license that has an accepted license that's accepted both by the Open Source Initiative as well as the Free Software Foundation. So the intersection of those licenses are acceptable to us. But yeah, that is really important, is that the source code that or the results, right, of your work are basically available in some kind of public open source code repository like GitHub or GitLab, and there's a license that actually meets those open source criteria. Does that answer your question? I mean, that's basically, yes. We don't want you to
yes, it does.
share any. Yeah, we don't want you to share any student information, right? But we require that the products of that work are open source and available.
Okay, thank you.
Great. All right.
Other
questions? If not, sorry.
Yeah, so I just want to really quickly say, some of the we will make sure that in some cases we will have gift letters, like for instance, if industry funding is involved, right, we will have that in what we call open source research gifts, and it will be actually a gift letter that has written open source into it, right? So it's basically, we found a way to do that, so we can actually track that kind of funding as well. So again, the details are forthcoming, but that's basically the idea that everything that comes out of this effort is open source. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. And yeah, if you have questions, on how to add your project ideas, or just want to chat a little bit longer with us about it, have detailed questions about your particular project, feel free to email us. You have Carlos's email address, or any other way you want to get hold of us. And again, there's I think on the link in the email that invited you here also is a link to the web page that we have about the OSRE, which has a lot of the links that you need. And this video will be put there, and the mentor guide will also be put there. But if you have any questions before I get the guide up, please feel free to reach out and let me know. Right?
All right.
All right. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.